Joey, start us off here. Who is your biggest running back bust for the 2023 season?
So my biggest running back bust, and I just want to kind of tout something real quick. The underdog ADP has been really on mark this offseason. Like leading up to the season, trying to find a bust through this ADP I was really having to split some hairs. But I did notice that James Cook was going as the RB 30, and that's 95th overall, and that's fair value. But 22 spots behind him was somebody that Dave that you just talked about in your breakouts or sleepers was Damian Harris. And like before I get into Harris, let me just say, like in PPR, I think James Cook is probably still a safe bet to put in the flex position. Not as an RB2, but more of like a flex. Uh, what I see for Damian Harris is that red zone role. Last season, Singletary had 17 carries inside the 10-yard line, and he only converted 4 of those into touchdowns. Where James Cook had, was it 11, converted none of them in touchdowns. So they bring Damian Harris in. We're only a season removed from where he had 29 carries inside the 10-yard line, and he turned 10 of those into touchdowns, had 15 total touchdowns on the season. So I do see Damian Harris as kind of that goal line back for this team, where James Cook, I'm afraid that when they get down there inside the 20, inside the 10, he's going to come off the field. So that just makes me a little bit nervous. I want my running backs on my team inside that red zone when they got the ball.
Yeah, I'm with you, and that is a concern that I have as well. I mean, looking back historically, Devin Singletary would always flutter right around 50 targets or so, but Josh Allen isn't a guy that targets the running backs a ton. But I think the investment in James Cook kind of says that, hey, we don't want you running as much. Kind of like we talked about. Again, we're tying this all together. This is fun when we do these like 3-part shows because we're able to kind of pull back from other shows. But we talked about Russell Wilson not using his legs quite as much and them going out and bringing in a pass catching back. Not that Josh Allen is in his mid-30s and needs to do that yet, but they invested $500 million nearly in Josh Allen. They want to keep him healthy as much as possible. So I think that going out and drafting James Cook, they're saying, hey, we brought you a very good guy who can catch the ball, throw it to him. Don't run and try to hurdle over people and drop your head every single time you need to pick up a few extra yards. Throw the ball to James Cook. And we didn't see it much last year, but I think that's something that they're trying to coach him up on to do a little bit. Jeff, did you see anything last year in Josh Allen's development that you think may help him a little bit when it comes to checking down rather than running the ball?
It's really hard to take away Josh Allen's season last year because he had the elbow injury against the Jets, and really I think a lot of what they looked at, the offensive line really struggled, and so I think they were just all over the place on offense last year. For as productive as they were, it was a new play caller, a new offensive scheme with Ken Dorsey coming in, an offensive line that struggled to protect, to allow for those vertical routes to develop. Josh Allen's elbow injury kind of taking off that accuracy on some of those vertical shots. Gabe Davis's failed development really stepped forward, having open questions on the slot role. And I think that this year, I do expect that they're going to have a plan to utilize the running backs more in the passing game because of the personnel that they have at running back now with Dalvin Cook, with James Cook. Gosh, maybe that's a Freudian slip.
But
with
I'm just
James
saying, we're
Cook
recording on Thursday. Show's not coming out until Sunday. You might be right. Who knows? We'll see.
Well, and with Naeem Hines there as well, we see the addition in the draft of adding Dalton Kincaid. I think that allows them to play a little bit heavier with a little more 12 personnel. They use him as a big slot if they use him in line as an extra tight end along with Dawson Knox. And so I think if you're loading heavier there with 2 tight ends, that sets you up for the screen game a lot more, and that's going to be planned usage for James Cook out of the screen game, and that's something that we haven't seen a lot of. But Ken Dorsey is a guy that he was in Carolina with Christian McCaffrey when Christian McCaffrey came into the league, and we saw a shift there where Cam Newton went from not really using the running backs in the passing game at all, being a guy that was going to hold the ball, being a guy that was going to allow to create, to Christian McCaffrey emerging as a primary receiver out of there. And God forbid I do not make any sort of comparisons between Christian McCaffrey and James Cook, because don't take me in the wrong direction. I'm just saying that somebody with that offensive background and has had that experience developing that type of quarterback that you do want to protect a little bit more, that you do want to get those easier plays to a running back. And I think James Cook coming out has that ability to get that usage in the passing game. And so I'm very bullish on James Cook. I mean, I don't blame you, Joey, for backing off there a little bit, and especially if you're kind of playing the backside stack on that on Damian Harris. But I think that James Cook has the opportunity to really step forward as a focal point for a very, very high value offense.
And I think that looking at the ADPs of both of these running backs in Buffalo, I mean, we talked about Nyheim Hines and Latavius Murray. Maybe they'll be on the week 1 roster, maybe they won't. But I think Damian Harris and James Cook are the two guys that are going to sit atop that depth chart, and they're both going to have specific roles. But I think that people have gotten so nervous because we haven't seen the high value touches going to running backs in Buffalo over the years that I kind of see both of these guys as values. Right now, James Cook is getting drafted as RB30. Damian Harris is getting drafted as RB39. I think that we can see it play out kind of exactly how we envision, where the passing work goes to James Cook, goal line work goes to Damian Harris, and both of these guys can pay off at ADP. And I think what's happened is the uncertainty as to how it's going to shake out has caused them both to get pushed down draft boards to the point that they're both values. So, Joey, I agree with you. I think that Damian Harris is a good value, and I think that if you're going to think that Damian Harris steps into that big role, it makes sense to fade James Cook a little bit. But personally, I'm kind of in on both of these backs at cost a little bit. But I think you made some good points there, and I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I mean, we're just speculating right now. It is June; anything can happen. But I think that both of the guys are good values right now.
I mean, I'm always right, but that,
Is that a last name joke?
That's a last name joke? I've been using that one since like the second grade.
I thought so. All right, well,
Still
Joey,
kills every time.
You are right. Can't push back on that one anymore.
But I'm also wrong a lot too. So.
So that leaves us with the next the next bust that we want to talk about. Jeff, throwing the mic over to you. Who is your running back bust?
Yeah, so I've been on this for a little while, and now the things have started to heat up and catch on to where I was. But I wrote an article in late April. I kind of did a brain dump about all 32 NFL teams and the way that I saw a lot of their fantasy positions stacking up. And Doug Peterson has pounded the table and talked again and again about wanting to use a committee backfield. And you look at Miles Sanders when Miles Sanders was in Philadelphia. How frustrating was Miles Sanders and not stepping forward and seeing other backs like Jay Ajayi or Boston Scott or all these random guys that you could name that kept getting carries, and Miles Sanders never got that full target load, that full running back share. And so then you see that Jacksonville Jaguars go out and in free agency, a lower key move, they added Dearness Johnson, and Dearness Johnson's quietly a good solid running back. And then the draft a little bit higher move, they took Tank Bigsby on day 2, and so now they're pairing Tank Bigsby, and they bring him back Jermichael Hasty and adding Dearness Johnson, and of course the name that we haven't mentioned yet, Travis Etienne. And Travis Etienne, last year, early in the year, we saw James Robinson really step forward as being that primary running back, and Etienne serving as a complementary back. And then we saw James Robinson fall off and eventually get traded to the Jets, and Etienne emerge as that primary running back. But even when that happened, he still finished that stretch, and gosh forbid, I would not want to be accused of cherry picking, but if we were to cherry pick and take Travis Etienne's best run of football last year, he was still RB12 during that run when he didn't have anybody else splitting that backfield with him, and he's going off the board right now as RB12. And so with the addition of Tank Bigsby, and I know that there is narrative around Travis Etienne's usage in the passing game, and Travis Etienne is not a natural receiver, and I think it's really important for people to realize that Jacksonville didn't really use him much in the passing game last year. And if you look at his college production, he had 1 year with Trevor Lawrence in college where essentially he came back to school and they were very vocal about him wanting to develop in the passing game because he knew he lacked that in order to get drafted in the NFL. And so they used a lot of screens, a lot of planned running back pass action. And so his numbers spiked his last year at Clemson because they were trying to showcase that skill set, but he's not a natural receiver. And Tank Bigsby is a more natural receiver than Travis Etienne. And so I think that there's a lot of talk about Travis Etienne might still be the passing back, even if Tank Bigsby's around, but I think that actually could flip another direction where Tank Bigsby is the passing back, and maybe Tank Bigsby is a little bit more of a physical runner, might even be the goal line back too, and you might be left with Travis Etienne as more of a complementary piece. And for me, to go RB12 with Travis Etienne, and I want to. Where is the overall falling on running back 12? I wish I knew that off the top of my
36.
head.
So he's getting drafted pretty much at the 3-4 turn.
Yes. Exactly. So he's getting drafted at the 3-4 turn, and that is my other thought on this. Is what we're seeing a lot of the wide receivers being pushed up in underdog especially. And so a lot of the reason that happened, a lot of the reason why you would go 0 RB in the past is because the stud running backs were going off the board. And so you were taking the depth of the wide receivers. But now what's happening is you have wide receiver 8, wide receiver 9, wide receiver 10 in half PPR formats going on the 1-2 turn, and then you're turning around and taking Travis Etienne on that 3-4 turn, where you could be stepping into having a deficiency at your wide receiver on the 1-2 turn because you're allowing Justin Jefferson to go off the 101, Jamar Chase to go early, these other elite running back or these other elite wide receivers go early. Those teams drafting early are doubling down and grabbing the stud running backs that you're allowing to slip, and then you're turning around and grabbing Travis Etienne, who might be stuck into a timeshare, and you're just flushing an entry there, an underdog, because you have wide receiver 8 and RB maybe 12 as your primary focal building points. And so for me, I'm just off on him completely at that sort of valuation. It's just you have to run such a narrow course of outcomes to deliver on that and be able to be a league winner type running back to push up the valuation. And it's something that Doug Peterson has not historically done, and it's something that Doug Peterson has said he's not interested in doing.
Yeah, and there's two running backs going right after Travis Etienne that I prefer outright. Jahmyr Gibbs and Najee Harris, who I would prefer both of those guys just outright to Travis Etienne. But then, like you said, when you start looking at some of the other positions that are going in that area, behind Travis Etienne, after Travis Etienne, we're looking at Amari Cooper, DeAndre Hopkins, Christian Watson, Jerry Jeudy, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams. I mean, there's a lot of really talented wide receivers that are growing there as well. So, Jeff, I was really pounding the table for Travis Etienne last year and felt like I struck gold, and it didn't really work out, unfortunately, after looking at how this offseason is kind of shaken out. But I'm with you. I think that RB12 valuation is just a little bit too high on him. And one thing that I'm surprised you didn't even mention, so many people lean on that first round draft capital with Travis Etienne. I feel like you got to throw that out the window when you look at the staff that drafted him. That was the Urban Meyer Jacksonville Jaguars that paid up for Travis Etienne in the first round when they really didn't have a pressing need at running back. It was kind of looked at as a reach at the time. And now seeing what we've seen from Urban Meyer as an NFL head coach, probably didn't really deserve that first round draft capital that he got. So, when you look at his profile as a whole, you got to take a lot of that with a grain of salt, given the disaster of Urban Meyer and what he did that season. Joey, anything that you'd like to add here talking about this? I talked about some of the other players there. Anybody that really kind of jumps out to you that you'd prefer? Najee, Gibbs, Hopkins, Watkins, Jeudy. It seems like there's so many other players going.
Yeah, all those names you said. Maybe Christian Watson. I might take Etienne over Christian Watson. But, I was super excited about this Jacksonville offense coming, and I still am, especially for Trevor Lawrence. But there's a lot of mouths to feed. And it's funny, you mentioned Tank Bigsby is a good pass-catching running back. He actually led Auburn and was at receptions last season. Like, he can catch the ball, and that's an area that Etienne hasn't really shown that he can do in the NFL. I was so high on Etienne. I think at some point this offseason I had him as my RB7, and then Tank Bigsby got drafted, and just every little thing that keeps happening just keeps going lower and lower. So I'm pretty much out on him as well at his current value.
Yeah, makes it pretty tough to pay up for him at that point. Mm-hmm. Now that we've seen what we've seen throughout this offseason. If you're watching the show on YouTube right now, though, you can find a link in the description below to the podcast version. So what we do on YouTube is we just cut out some little parts from the podcast, put it up on YouTube so you can watch it. But if you want to check out the entire show, where we get even a little bit deeper than what we're talking about on this YouTube channel, talking about sleepers, busts, little commentary, banter, introductions, jokes, all that sort of fun stuff, check out the link in the description below. You can find this podcast anywhere podcasts are found. Just search the Launchpad, Footballguys, Dave Kluge. You'll be able to find it no problem. Now let's go ahead and wrap up with my bust, and I went pretty high up the board here. I'm looking at RB21, and it is Dalvin Cook, and there's a ton of uncertainty right now as to where Dalvin Cook could land. Now, if we start getting further and further into the offseason and Dalvin Cook is still in Minnesota, I'll probably eat my words on this a little bit, but right now it looks like Dalvin Cook could potentially be cut, and I think that would just be terrible for his value. Last year, he finishes the RB11, but that was mostly due to being healthy for a full 17-game season. He was the RB15 in points per game, but so much of his value was propped up by his volume. He was fifth in snaps, He was 5th in opportunities. He was 6th in carries. He was 2nd in routes run. He was on the field a ton. He was running a ton of routes. He was getting a ton of touches, but he didn't really do all of that much with the opportunities that he was giving. Just about every single metric we saw him dip in last year. Looking at rushing yards over expectation per attempt, that's one of my favorite metrics. I talk about it all the time on this show. He was one of the worst in the league last year. These are the only running backs that had a worse rushing yard over expectation per attempt than Dalvin Cook last year. Rachaad White, Ezekiel Elliott, Najee Harris, who was injured for half the season, Leonard Fournette, James Robinson coming off an Achilles tear, Michael Carter, and Melvin Gordon. That's it. I mean, a very short list of running backs who were less effective than Dalvin Cook was on the touches that they were given. He was 51st in fantasy points per opportunity. Despite playing on a powerhouse offense, getting goal line work, getting passing opportunities, he was still 51st in fantasy points per opportunity. So the Vikings have expressed some interest in letting him walk, and we'll see whether that happens or not. But regardless of where he goes, it's pretty unlikely that he is going to end up with the same volume that he saw in Minnesota last year. So when I'm looking at Dalvin Cook, I'm seeing a guy who's a first-round draft pick, perennial Pro Bowler, has looked like an MVP-level talent at times throughout his career, but right now he's an aging back with dwindling efficiency, where the team that drafted him 6 years ago has kind of thrown in the towel on him. If he loses out on that volume that propped up his output last year, he's going to come up very, very short of that RB21 price tag. And right now, maybe he stays in Minnesota, and if he does, he's probably going to see another top 10 workload. But if he ends up on a different team, I think people are going to get excited by the name Dalvin Cook and the potential for a new scenery, but I just don't see him living up to that RB21 price tag. Joey, what are your thoughts here? I mean, Dalvin Cook is a name that has just consistently been finishing as an RB1 year after year after year. Are you buying into it this year?
Yeah, so it's his workload last year was immense. So much, in fact, that I was looking at Madison as my possible bust. And then when I looked at it, I was like, well, Madison was pretty efficient with what he got last year. It just looked like he almost got the season off because he was barely on the field. So, I mean, if you think of just the amount of workload Dalvin Cook had to the point that he's in his career, I mean, if he's not with Minnesota, anywhere he goes, I just think he's probably going to fall off a little bit.
Yeah, and I think
So,
people have this idea that, like, if he goes to Miami, which is the big rumor right now, that if he
no,
lands in Miami, I don't think he's going to be seeing 300 touches in Miami. I think he's in a
no,
rotation with Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson Jr. and Devin Etienne, and that's not great for fantasy when you're in a four-headed committee like that.
no.
I don't know if he's going to go anywhere where he sees the volume that he saw in Minnesota. So that's what I'm going to say. The best case scenario is that he just stays in Minnesota
Stays there. Yeah.
for whatever reason, loves to just feed him the rock. Jeff, I know you're not agreeing with me 100% on this Dalvin Cook take. Talk to me a little bit about how you feel about Cook this year.
Well, I mean, we talk about baked into ADP, and I think that Dalvin Cook is a perfect example of every downside risk is baked into ADP. I just don't see him landing in a committee wherever he lands up. And I think that I don't know, he's still a Viking right now. And the post-June designation, we talked about that on the Joe Mixon, potentially with the Bengals, the post-June 1 designation. And June 1st is only a magic number because now he becomes tradable. And that is the big thing that changed there. And they're just not going to cut him. They've already, in my opinion, I mean, maybe it turn out wrong, and by the time this airs and I look silly, and that would not be the very first time that would happen, and it's not going to be the last time that's going to happen. But they've already made cost-cutting moves with Zadarius Smith, the move Zadarius Smith off, and so they're well under the cap right now. And so, in my opinion, what they're going to do is, one, their defense is going to be bad, and I think they're going to be in a lot of shootouts, and so they're going to be in shootouts, and I think that they're going to run Dalvin Cook into the ground while he's still an asset on the Minnesota Vikings, and then they're going to move on from him. And so we've seen that before. We saw that with even a fun one to talk about that maybe would be topical would be the Dallas Cowboys last year with Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard, and seeing the name
Pollard's
value.
a much better talent than Madison, too.
He is a much better talent, but we see the name value and what that means to the franchise, and they really went out of their way to set Ezekiel Elliott up to score all the touchdowns, and so I think that that's a prime example where even if Madison does earn more usage, cut into that role, I think that when they get down to the goal line, they're going to try to give it to their guy, Dalvin Cook, and I think that as long as he's there, they're going to do everything in their power to push him forward as being the face of the franchise, as being a key contributing member. I think a lot of what's happened currently is they want to be able to save a little bit of money on that contract. They know where the landscape is in terms of running backs around the league, and so They were hoping to push Cook into agreeing to a lower number, kind of get a little bit more security in the future for Cook. And I think that his agent was pushing back and started floating some rumors about him being potentially released, potentially new teams. I think that it's all really a lot of what's happening and a lot of what people are acting on right now is negotiation ploys from both the team and from the agent side. And so in the dynasty landscape, it's interesting to me on if you couldn't acquire Alexander Madison without paying a starting running back price for him, because everybody is convinced that Dalvin Cook was going to be cut and everybody's waiting for June 1st. And you know what, to be honest with you, we're recording this at 9 o'clock at night on June 1st and Dalvin Cook is still a Minnesota Viking. So there was still the post June 1st designation. They could have moved on to him at any time. And moving forward, I'm operating him as being a Minnesota Viking. And that's the way I view it.
Yeah, and that's a totally reasonable take. And I started off mine saying that if he stays with the Vikings, I will be eating my words. But right now, I mean, and again, I could just be the mark right now, taking all of this for truth. But Dalvin Cook has expressed interest in wanting to leave. The Minnesota Vikings have made it sound like they are happy to let him walk. His agent said that he is already looking at some possible trade scenarios. So maybe I am the fool for buying into these rumors. But I think the best case scenario for Dalvin Cook would be staying in Minnesota. But if he does leave, I think that there is a very small chance that he can live up to that RB21 price tag. Well, that'll do it today. We made it through some more sleepers and busts. Be sure to come back next week when we talk about sleepers and busts at the wide receiver and tight end position and wrap up this series that has been such a pleasure to record with two of my good friends here, Jeff and Joey. Before we log off, though, one more time. Joey, let everyone know where they can find you on social media.
At the Joey Wright on Twitter. I think that's the only one I'm on. No, I'm on Instagram too, but all I do is talk about movies there. So,
the same thing. I'm on Instagram too, but like rock climbing and mountain climbing, I don't know how much that overlaps between my fantasy football audience. So I just keep that one to myself and only promote the Twitter. But Jeff, let everyone know where they can find you, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, OnlyFans, wherever you want your fans to find you.
Well, I think you can probably find me on Instagram as well, but I think I've maybe posted once and I didn't know how to post again on there. So my wife tags me in things on there, and that's kind of what I use that for. But you can find me on Twitter for whom J Bell tolls, and that's where I spend way too much of my time. And find me there, and of course, find me, find Dave, find Joey at Footballguys, and we've got so much content coming out to you.
If you find some of my podcasts from about this time last summer, you might be able to find like 2 or 3 podcasts where I was actually plugging my TikTok, where I thought that I was going to do that. That lasted all of a week before I realized I'm just a little bit too old for this app. I don't really understand what's happening here. I'm going to go back to Twitter, which is my safe place. And you can find me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. That's Kluge. Of course, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe at youtube.com/footballguys. If you're listening on podcasts, leave us a review and let us know what you thought about the show. And of course, thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. On the right side of your screen, you're going to see some other videos that we have on the Footballguys YouTube, so you can check out some other shows that we have, like the Audible, the Pretend GM, the Footballguys College Football Show, and so much more. If you haven't already, subscribe at youtube.com/footballguys and give us a thumbs up on this video, because that is going to help some other people find it. Thank you so much for tuning in.